Hey everyone, welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into something you sent to us. It's the GHG Protocol Corporate Value Chain Accounting and Reporting Standard.
That's a mouthful.
Yeah, I know, right?
Yeah.
It's a bit of it's not exactly the snappiest title,
No,
but
not the most exciting sounding thing at first glance.
no, it's not the sexiest thing we've ever dived into, but trust me on this one. Okay.
Yeah.
This standard, this is like the secret decoder ring
Yeah.
for like really understanding a company's environmental impact, you know?
Yeah, and what I think is really fascinating about it is that it goes way beyond just looking at their immediate operations, like their offices or their factories or whatever. It's about their entire value chain. So every single step from sourcing the raw materials to what happens to those products at the very end of their life.
Okay, so it's like a massive environmental audit, but for like their whole business ecosystem.
Exactly. And you see most companies, they're really focused on reducing emissions from like their own operations, which is important, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But it's only part of the story. This standard helps uncover all those hidden emissions that are kind of lurking in their supply chain, in the transportation,
Yeah.
how the product's used, how it's disposed of. We're talking about a whole new level of transparency here.
Yeah, and I think that's where it gets interesting for like, you listening. Because with climate change and everything, everyone's more aware of this stuff now. Stakeholders are demanding this kind of transparency. They want to know, like, what is the real cost of what I'm buying and the companies I'm supporting?
The investors, customers, even potential employees, they're all using this information now to make more informed decisions. It's not just a box to tick on a sustainability report anymore.
Right.
It's about understanding like the full impact of what they're doing.
So how does this standard actually like work? I'm guessing it's not just like, hey, company, list your emissions, and then we'll see how you did. There's got to be more to it than that.
All right. You're right on the money. So the standard introduces this concept of scopes of emissions. And you can think of them kind of like layers of an onion. And scope 1, that's the innermost layer. That's the direct emissions from a company's own operations. So things like their company cars.
Right.
Or the natural gas they use to heat their office.
I suppose that's like their direct impact. What about the next layer?
The next layer is scope 2. And that covers the emissions from the energy that they buy. So the electricity to power their factories. Even if they're not like directly burning the fossil fuels, they're still driving that demand.
Okay, so no outsourcing your emissions, basically.
Yeah.
But then that brings us to scope 3. And this is where I imagine things get a little more
This is where it gets juicy.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, scope 3 is the broadest category and definitely the most complex because it covers all those other indirect emissions that happen across the company's value chain.
So like, what does that look like in practice? Like, give me an example.
Okay, so let's say you're a clothing company, right?
Yeah.
Your scope 3 emissions would include things like the emissions from the farms that are growing the cotton, the factories that are spinning that into fabric, the ships that are transporting the clothes, and even the energy that customers use when they wash and dry those clothes.
Wow, see, I never even would have thought about that. It's like, how far back does it go? But how on earth? How on earth does a company even begin to measure something like that?
Well, that's where those 15 categories come in. The standard provides this framework for companies to identify and then quantify those indirect emissions.
15 categories.
15 categories.
That's a lot of categories.
It is pretty comprehensive.
What are some of the like most common ones?
So one category is purchased goods and services. And that basically means companies need to consider the environmental impact of everything they buy, from office supplies to the raw materials for their products. Another category focuses on upstream transportation and distribution, which covers the emissions from moving those goods to the company's facilities.
Okay.
And then you've got downstream transportation and distribution,
Yeah.
which covers getting those products to the end customer. So it's really about looking at that whole journey from cradle to grave.
So it's like connecting all those dots
Yeah.
and saying like, yeah, we might not be the ones directly making this happen, but it's on us to acknowledge that this is happening because we're a part of it.
Yeah. It's about taking responsibility for those emissions,
Yeah.
even if you're not directly controlling them.
Yeah, this is where it starts to feel like a real game changer, right?
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that sustainability
Yeah.
isn't just about what happens within your own four walls.
Yeah.
It's about influencing that change
Yeah.
throughout your entire value chain,
Which is huge.
which is huge, yeah.
But I have to imagine measuring and managing that comes with its own challenges too, right?
Well, for sure. And that's exactly what we're going to unpack when we come back.
Yeah.
We're going to look at some of those hurdles companies face,
Yeah.
the solutions they're using to overcome them, and why this standard is so crucial for a more sustainable future.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Now we've been talking about this GHG protocol and how it helps companies measure those Scope 3 emissions. But, like, let's get real. You're probably sitting there thinking, this sounds ridiculously complicated.
Yeah.
Where do I even begin?
You're not wrong. It can feel really overwhelming,
Yeah.
especially for companies that are kind of just starting out
Yeah.
on their whole sustainability journey.
Yeah.
That's why the standard actually emphasizes this kind of phased approach. It's not about boiling the ocean all at once, right?
Right.
It's about taking these strategic steps.
So it's like you wouldn't start building a house by putting the roof on first.
Exactly.
Got to lay the foundation.
Exactly. Lay that foundation. And so the first step is really about identifying, okay, which of those 15 Scope 3 categories
Mm-hmm.
are actually the most relevant to your business. So, if you're a car manufacturer, for example, purchase goods and services related to steel and aluminum production,
Mm-hmm.
that might be a top priority. But if you're a software company, it might be the energy use in those data centers
Mm-hmm.
that are housing all their products and data. So it's about really focusing on what matters most
Hmm.
for your specific industry and your operations.
Okay, so you're not just like spreading yourself too thin, trying to measure every single little thing. But even when you've narrowed it down like that, just actually gathering all that data
Yeah.
from your suppliers, your distributors, even your customers.
Oh, yeah.
That's going to be a logistical nightmare.
It could be a huge challenge. And that's why the standard does allow for some flexibility there.
Mm-hmm.
So ideally, you want what's called primary data. That's
Mhm.
data that's coming directly from your own records or from your suppliers' reports. But let's be real. Not every supplier is going to have that data just ready to go.
Especially if it's a smaller company or
If
something.
it's a smaller company. So that's where secondary data comes in. Think of it as your backup plan.
Okay.
You can use industry averages, publicly available databases, even research reports to kind of fill in those gaps.
So a little bit of educated guesswork?
In a way, yes. But it's really important to be transparent about it. The standard's very clear about disclosing your data sources and any assumptions you've made. And this is where things get interesting, because that transparency can actually incentivize change across the entire value chain.
Okay, got it.
Well, let's say you're a company and you're using a lot of secondary data because your suppliers just aren't tracking their emissions. That's going to show up. And that can be a powerful motivator to start working more closely with those suppliers to improve their data collection practices.
Yeah, nobody wants to be the company that's not doing that.
No one wants to be the bad guy.
If everyone else is doing it and you're not,
Exactly.
that looks really bad.
Yeah, so it's like this ripple effect. By starting with their own Scope 3 assessments, companies can actually kind of push for greater transparency and greater sustainability throughout their entire network.
So it's like you're saying it's not about competition.
It's about collaboration.
Yeah.
It's about driving that systemic change, not just ticking boxes.
Okay, I
Okay.
love that. But let's say a company has gone through all that effort. They've collected the data, they've measured their Scope 3 emissions. What's next? Like, what do they actually do with that information?
That is the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And the good news is there are a lot of different options.
Okay.
So one strategy is to really engage with their suppliers on sustainability, maybe providing them with training or even incentives to help them reduce their own emissions. They could also look at switching to more sustainable materials, things like using recycled content or responsibly sourced timber.
So it's about making those smarter choices all along the way.
Exactly. And it's not just about what they're buying, it's also how they're moving those goods.
Okay.
Companies can optimize their transportation networks, maybe using more energy-efficient modes of transport
Well,
or consolidating shipments to reduce the number of trips.
so streamlining the whole process
It's a
to
plan.
reduce that footprint.
Exactly.
But I imagine some companies might be looking at this like, where do we even start? There's so many different things we could be doing.
And that's where that good Scope 3 assessment is key,
Oh,
because it helps you figure out where your biggest impacts are.
yeah.
So you can then prioritize those actions
Yeah.
that are really going to move the needle.
Okay.
It's about working smarter, not harder.
So it's like a roadmap
It's a roadmap for sustainability.
to tell you where to focus your efforts. But it's one thing to set these goals and make these changes. How do you actually know if it's working?
Yeah, that's where setting targets
Hmm.
and then tracking your emissions over time becomes crucial.
Okay.
The standard recommends establishing what's called a base year and then measuring your progress year on year. And this allows you to see, okay, what's working, what's not working. And then you can make adjustments along the way.
So it's not just like a one-time thing.
It's an ongoing process.
You're constantly monitoring.
Continuous improvement.
Okay. But what about those inevitable curveballs, like businesses evolve, supply chains shift, new technologies emerge? How do you account for all of that?
That's a great question. And that's where the flexibility of the standard comes in. It recognizes that things change, and it actually provides guidance on how to adjust your base year, or even recalculate your emissions if there are these significant changes in your operations or your supply chain.
So if you buy a new company
Exactly.
or you sell off part of your business,
Yet adjust your accounting.
gotcha.
Yep.
Keep it accurate.
Keep it accurate.
But I imagine there are also some nuances to this when you're talking about like different types of scope 3 emissions. Because if you're talking about like the use phase of a product, that's got to be a tough one to control.
You're absolutely right. It's one thing to make your products more energy efficient, but it's another thing entirely to control how customers use them once they leave the factory or the store.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that companies are powerless.
So what can they do?
Well, they can design their products with energy efficiency in mind. They can provide clear instructions on how to use and maintain those products responsibly, and they can even offer incentives for customers to recycle or dispose of products properly at the end of their life.
So you're shifting mindsets.
It's about shifting mindset.
Instead of just being like, well, we made the product, it's
Yeah.
like, how do we empower the customer to
Exactly. Also be a part of this.
shared responsibility?
Yeah, I love that. But how do companies know that when they're saying they're doing all this stuff, that it's actually credible? Because there's a lot of pressure these days to look green. How do we know that companies aren't just like fudging the numbers?
It's a really important point. And it's something that the GHG protocol takes very seriously. They strongly encourage, and in some cases require, that companies get what's called external assurance for their scope 3 inventories.
So it's like having someone else double check their work.
It's like an independent auditor coming in and verifying that everything is on the up and up.
Okay.
And this adds a layer of credibility. It's about ensuring that the data is accurate, the calculations are sound, and that the company is truly walking the talk.
So it builds that trust.
It builds trust that they're actually doing what they say they're doing. But I'm sure not every company is thrilled about this whole thing.
Of course not.
What are some of the obstacles that companies face when it comes to actually implementing this standard? Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been uncovering the ins and outs of the GHG protocol, especially those scope 3 emissions. And you know what? Not every company is jumping for joy over this.
You're preaching to the choir.
So let's talk about those obstacles. What are companies struggling with when it comes to putting this standard into practice?
Well, you hit the nail on the head earlier. Data availability. That's a big one. Trying to wrangle accurate and consistent data from every nook and cranny of your value chain. It can feel like a colossal game of hide and seek.
Especially with suppliers scattered across the globe, right? Different industries, different tech, different levels of, well, everything.
Exactly. You might stumble upon a supplier who's like the sustainability superhero,
Yeah.
meticulously tracking every ounce of carbon.
Yeah.
And then you turn around and bump into another one who's just starting to dip their toes into the whole environmental impact thing.
So it's not just about gathering data, but about building that shared language around sustainability, right? Making sure everyone's on the same page.
Precisely. And that takes time, resources, patience, the whole shebang. And then, of course, there's the cost factor, measuring and managing scope 3 emissions. It's an investment, no doubt about it.
New software, hiring experts, all of that adds up.
Absolutely. And let's be real. For some companies, especially those smaller ones working with tighter budgets, that investment can feel like a mountain to climb.
Right. They're thinking, can we even afford to track this stuff?
Exactly. And it's a legitimate concern. It really is.
But then again, what's the cost of doing nothing?
The million-dollar question.
Because ignoring this isn't really an option anymore, is it?
Not if you want to stay in the game, so to speak.
Right.
I think we're seeing a massive shift in how people view all of this.
Yeah, it's not just about the bottom line anymore.
Exactly. Investors, customers, employees, they're all making decisions based on values now. They're looking at companies that align with their own commitment to sustainability.
Companies have to walk the walk, not just talk the talk.
100%.
Yeah.
And the companies that embrace this, the ones who see it as an opportunity for innovation rather than a roadblock, those are the ones that are going to come out on top.
So for our listeners out there who are ready to roll up their sleeves and dive into this, what's your advice? What are some key takeaways?
If I could offer one golden nugget of wisdom, it would be this. Don't get stuck in the pursuit of perfection. You don't need to have every single answer, every data point perfectly aligned before you even begin. Start somewhere. Learn as you go.
Yeah.
And be open to adjusting your approach.
This marathon, right?
Exactly. A marathon, not a sprint. And never lose sight of the bigger picture. This isn't just about ticking boxes or complying. It's about building a more resilient and responsible business and ultimately a more sustainable future for all of us.
This has been such an insightful deep dive. Listener, you're swimming in knowledge right now. Remember, you don't need a fancy title to make a difference. Every choice you make, every product you support, it sends a ripple through those value chains. Be mindful, stay curious, and keep asking those tough questions. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll catch you next time.